I'll be doing poet Philip Larkin, his church-going poem, and the age is post-modern age. It's the 50s. Uh, I'll just start with a little bit about the age. So we are talking about the time when the World War had happened. Yeah, the World War had happened, and the poem is basically about church going, and the poem basically is about the tradition of going to church, which had become less and less, and people had lost faith in religion, had lost faith in something which was very important. Religion played an important role for such a long time. So it was due to the post-war stress and what people had seen, the way it affected. So they had lost faith in religion, and I'll just tell you a little background. So at that time, you have Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. He had initially he tried to avoid going to war by making Germany, Hitler, happy, and Hitler had annexed parts of Czechoslovakia. But then they invaded Poland. When they invaded Poland, this was in 1939. Britain realized their mistake, that they should not have done this what they did. मतलब खुश करने के लिए they had said okay, fine, fine, you go ahead and annex. But later on they realized nahi, this is getting out of hand. So Britain and the allies, they went to war. Of course they won, but what was the outcome? What was the aftermath? It was devastating. It was devastating by way of property, by way of lives, by the deaths. The number of deaths is more than 900,000 civilians and military deaths happened, and that is something which left a mark on everyone. So Britain, first of all, lost her glory. She lost her glory, and her empire, which was a magnificent, she was the symbol of imperialism for such a long time. So she lost, and people, of course, there was poverty, there was physical damage of property, and people lost their jobs. There was a sense of isolation among people who were going about their life, and religion, which was very, very important, it was not giving the answers which people, the answering the questions the people asked, that why was this happening. And then what happened is Britain, due to all this, the bombings and all that, the dissolution and everything, the welfare state was established. But the welfare state, basically, the government helps the people. Welfare state is something where the government steps in and helps. But it was not enough. It was not enough, and people were not comforted by all this. There was a lot of anger, there was a lot of hopelessness. And if you recall, guys, we've studied play, Look Back in Anger, if you recall. This is the angry young man of the 50s. So I'm just trying to, keep that in mind, that this is what it's referring to, the anger. The guys who were angry, the people who were angry at that time, they were angry due to this. The war, whatever they had seen, it had left such a strong impact. Everything had changed because of that. So, right. Postmodernism, there are certain features, as every age which happens, like metaphysical or romanticism, it's a reaction to the previous age. So, over here also, the movement poets and the reaction was to Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot, who dictated, and they kind of commanded respect. Also, they had a kind of a, you can say, a dictatorship of sorts. People had to be, everything had to be like the way they wanted. And what happened is, also there was Dylan Thomas. His poems, sorry, was excessive. Too much of emotion. And the movement poets, what they wanted is, they wanted something which was a little different, more real according to what they were facing. That is the after effects of the war. So the idea, Postmodernism, I mean, basically doesn't mourn the idea of transience, disjointedness, fragmentation. When I'm saying this, I'm referring to the traits of modernism, the one before that. Modernism has, experimentation, disjointedness, fragmentation, and it kind of celebrates it. If you remember Wasteland and T.S. Eliot, what we just did recently, those are the traits of features of modernism. So, like, I'll just quickly go over the features of postmodernism. So, postmodernism is a belief in that there is no absolute truth. Truth is relative. Basically, what is true for me may not be true for you. I hope I'm audible to everyone. Am I? Hello?
Yes, you are. You're
Okay,
very
great, great,
audible.
great, great. Yeah, I
Yes,
was going
of
on for some.
course. Carry on.
Yeah, just
Carry
continue.
on.
If
Okay,
you want to
thank
keep
you.
saying, if you want me to keep saying, I'll keep doing that.
Oh,
So that
yeah, do it after every few minutes. That'll help. Thanks,
okay,
thanks.
okay.
Right, I'll continue. So, right. So there is no truth which is an absolute truth. It's relative. It's relative in the sense what might be right and real or truthful or the truth for one person. It may not be the in the same situation. The other person might not see it in that way. It's a point of view. It's a perspective, whatever you want to call it. So that is that person's reality. मतलब हमारा सच मेरा सच कुछ और है तुम्हारा सच कुछ और है. It's like that. Okay, then you have modernism, which had placed a lot of ideas, a lot of value in ideas, particular beliefs, cultures, Western norms. So postmodernism, as such, rejected those Western values, and they wanted to kind of look at the human experience. They wanted to look at the human experience, which they thought that was the real part, and that's what they went with postmodernism. Okay, postmodernism, of course, avoids drawing conclusions, and they suggest there is a lot of underlying meaning in objects, preferring to reflect on exterior image. Now here there is a small reference again I'll make to Waiting for Godot, the play. Waiting for Godot, if you remember, there is no conclusion. There is no conclusion in the play. We don't know. We are left hanging as to what happens, and there is no specific meaning. There is a mishmash and more than one meaning. So that's what again postmodernism goes for. Okay, right. Modern authors, of course, they could control a reader's response to their work, whereas postmodern writers, authors, what they did is, again, I'm referring to Waiting for Godot, the play. So that has multiple interpretations, multiple meanings depending on who's watching. Yeah, so that is another trait of postmodernism. Yeah. There is irony, skepticism, a lot of dark humor. These are the features of postmodernism. Now we'll just get on with the movement poets, a little bit about them. So Philip Larkin, he belonged to the movement poets of the 1950s. Movement, it was a very aggressive, nationalistic, and cynical backlash. Cynical backlash to there was an elitist kind of poetry and which was happening, literature which was happening in the 30s and the 40s. So this was a kind of a reaction to that, and you have people like Eliot, Auden, Pound, and others who wrote a specific kind of poetry. And then you have Larkin, Amis, DJ Enright, Robert Conquest, Donald Davy, Thomas Gunn. These are the names of the people, more prominent names in the movement. These people, if you look at them individually, they didn't have a lot in common. What they had in common was they were part of this movement, and in fact, a lot of people in the group itself, they did not say that yeah, we are going to call ourselves movement poets. They did not call themselves movement poets. They just did their writing, which was particularly their writing was what they had in common, but they were different as individuals. They were very, very different with different backgrounds. Now they brought out a collection of poets of the 1950s and new lines. This specifically was a protest against Eliot and Auden's school of poetry. And They rejected the idealism of romantics. They found it definitely not. There was no reasoning, no rationale behind having that kind of poetry or kind of work in the harsh and uh, horrible times which they were seeing, post-war. Okay. Eliot, according to this is according to the movement poets, Eliot was considered too clever. He was so well read and he used so many allusions in his poetry. And the common man who was not that well read, reading so many different languages and mythology, Greek, Latin, and so many other things, common man did not even read probably 1/5 of that. So they could not understand what Eliot was saying in his poetry, what he wanted to convey, what were his thoughts. Pound, on the other hand, he was very flamboyant and he was quite unconventional in his poetry. He was elitist. He had a very specific, again, kind of poetry which did not appeal to a lot of people. It was not understood. Okay, then we'll talk about Larkin. Philip Larkin, he was born in Coventry in 1922. He did not have a very special kind of childhood, something like what Dylan Thomas talks about in his poems, you know, of a golden age of childhood and all that. No, he did not have all that. He says he has had a very, very ordinary, normal childhood. He attended this school, King Henry the Eighth School. He contributed to the school magazine by writing poetry, and he did undergrad studies at Oxford. And he met people like Kingsley Amis and John Wayne, with whom he had his formed friendships with. He had his first job as a librarian at a local library in Wellington, actually, and that's what he kind of took up as his career, which again took him to many different places. And England at this time was a major participant in the World War One. So when you look at Larkin's poetry, the skepticism, the form, and this you can associate, the stuff which is associated with the movement. This is again a reaction to the World War. So his poetry shows all that. He has a very, very deep imaginative grasp of what is happening around us, the social experience, and of course, literary devices. He uses them very skillfully. His first book of poems was called North Ship. It was published in 1945. It was not as remarkable and not mature as his later work, but looking at that work, it kind of, you come to know what he is going to become in later life. His unique voice, his sensibilities, and his, the wit, the um, pessimism which is there in his work, even the satire, the biting, the lines which he uses in his poetry. He makes no, he doesn't make any kind of, doesn't think like, uh, just a moment. Yeah, so there is this poem called Send No Money. He uses plain language, very, very plain language, and he is described himself in this particular poem as a observer of life, but not an active participant. He had his own, what do you call it, reservations about life, about religion, but things which are you see in Larkin's poems are that he is very, very observant, he is very witty, and his wit is present in many of his poems. But he is also pessimistic, very gloomy, pessimistic, which a lot of people complain about, that yeah, his poetry is gloomy and pessimistic. But that, I think, is offset by his wit, and he has got a very remarkably confessional voice in his poems. And he was influenced by people like W.H. Auden and W.B. Yeats. There were others like D.H. Lawrence, George Eliot, and Thomas Hardy. These are the other people who influenced him. Okay, Church Going, the particular poem we are doing today, it's part of this series, uh, The Less Deceived. This was published in 1955. It has 29 poems. It's, of course, this is where his particular voice, people noticed his voice, his unique voice, very cynical, very expressive, pessimistic, insightful, and it reflected everything which was going around him at that time. That was, people noticed that. He spoke about what was going around him. And two of his most admired poems in this collection are Church Going and Lines on a Young Lady's Photograph Album. They're supposed to be personal monologues, and they deal with the particular theme of loss of time of religious belief. So I'll go into the summary of Church Going. The speaker is drawn to visit a church. He is goes to church over there not for being religious, for worship, and he is there as an observer. He wants to go and explore the place, the church itself, and understand why people are there in the first place. So we there is a lot of irony in his voice. There's a lot of irony, and he he tries to understand and tell the person, the us, the readers, that what exactly does the value of a church have to a common man. I mean, why is it valuable? So in the particular times when people have stopped going to church the way as much as they used to earlier, it still has value for a lot of people, though the value is growing less every day. So the poet, of course, emphasizes that people need to have faith in something. They need to preserve the church because it's been an icon of faith. It's been an icon, a place which ties human beings together. It unites human beings, and people go there maybe not to find answers, but to just find some peace, maybe, because everywhere around them, the times are so turbulent. There is death, there's destruction, there's loss of life, loss of money, relationships breaking down, and that is the one place where a person might want to go to find a little peace, to be with his own thoughts, maybe even to find answers. Okay, I'll do the stanza wise explanation of the poem now. So, the first particular stanza is: Speaker is outside the church. He decides to come in, and he steps in only when he's sure there's nothing going on. So what we understand, we as the readers understand that maybe probably if there's some activity going on, the speaker might have gone in. He wants to avoid any particular mass or sermon or anything which is going on. He doesn't want to do that. So as we come to know, Larkin was an agnostic, basically a person who is not really uh, having 100% faith in God, but he doesn't disbelieve God also at the same time. So he wants to go to church by himself when it's absolutely quiet. What he sees around is matting, the seats, stones, a pew, the altar, the lectern. These are all names of what I'm saying, areas of the church. I mean, I won't go into detail. If you look at the study material, there is the description given in the poem. There's a glossary. Terms are given. You can read up. So, his tone over here is very, very unimpressed. He is not impressed by the church, and he might even be ignorant about the books which are, the prayer books, the little books. Then he has come on a particular day, which was after Sunday, probably a Monday or a Tuesday, where Sunday where you have mass and you have flowers which are decorated. Those flowers are now become brown. So there's been some time between the Sunday mass and the time when the poet is coming. He can see brass stuff which is referring to this brass monumental plates, and all that, which is found in church in England churches. There is an organ which has been taken care of. So it's not dusty. So he notices that. Larkin, being observant, he mentions all that, and he says, God knows how long. He says, God knows how long in a blasphemous way. You don't take God's name in vain, according to Catholics. So it's slightly blasphemous, his tone. And he, of course, talks about how tense, musty, ignoble silence. So the speaker's feelings are over here are very ambiguous and ambivalent. It's not clear. He switches from one thing to another. He switches. You feel at one moment maybe he is not, completely. He does believe in something, but then again with his mocking tone, you see, okay, that he is mocking. So I mean, is he a real believer? He seems to be uninterested, and then again he shows reverence in a very contradictory manner by removing his cycle clips. Cycle clips are basically when you wear pants and you go cycling, you put these clips so that the end of the pant doesn't get into the wheels of the cycle, and you'll fall off. So he is not wearing a hat. So normally when you go into a church, a holy place, you take off your hat. You take off your hat as a sign of respect. So since he is hatless at this point, he takes off what his cycle clips. It's like a way of, okay, I'm showing respect. So another church in the third line may signify the speaker is in habit of visiting churches, like people, like the way they visit museums maybe. That's the way this man, the speaker, is coming into the church and searching for something. What he's searching for, we'll get to know. So in stanza 2, then he runs his hand in the baptismal font. It's a font, basically, it's a small little bowl, a marble kind of a place, like a chotu fountain with, water in it. It's holy water. So he runs his hand in that to wash. And that itself, again, is a religious ritual and act. He looks up at the roof, which is almost new. He wonders, sorry, whether it's been restored because it's been maintained pretty well. So he thinks, yeah, maybe the church is being cared for, but he's not sure. He doesn't know. So he goes over to the lectern, reads some verses from the Bible, and, pretends to be very reverent and, very pious and everything. And then says, here endeth. Here endeth, the words he uses, says, are a particular tradition of wrapping up a Bible reading. So that's how he ends that particular verse. And he's a little self-conscious. He said the words a bit louder, and the echoes are sniggering at him. Echoes over here are being personified, and this over here endeth. Again, there is a double meaning. There is a pun on the words there. Maybe it may be referring to just the fact that he's finished reading, or it might be referring to the fact that religion itself is ending. He then takes a Irish sixpence, which is like a quarter in American money. So it has got nothing, no, I mean, hardly any value. And so, okay. So we could interpret this particular act in any which way. It could be that he's indifferent, or he doesn't believe that, if he donates this little bit, if he's doing it as an act, does it have any value? We don't know. And he signs his name in the book very reluctantly. He signs it. Okay, moving on to stanza 3. He wonders about the purpose of the church. He doesn't understand, what is the power of a church. I mean, what will happen if the church is gone? If people stop coming. What will happen? Will the church artifacts, will they be taken out from the church, put it in and be put in a museum on display? So will the value of the church become zero? What will happen? Will people stop coming there? And the artifacts, do the artifacts hold more value, or do the church grounds have more value? I mean, which is more valuable? He mentions objects like PYX. So that is a box for communion wafers. Communion wafers are something which in a particular ritual, it's used by the priest. And then there is he refers to parchment. Parchment basically with religious writing on it. Plates, these plates, these all are references of objects which are used in rituals in the church. And the speaker wonders, that maybe, if the church totally kind of shuts down, that anyone stops coming, everyone stops coming, there'll be a growth of, greenery. It'll go wild because it'll be uncared for. You'll be having animals, cattle, coming in and using the place. And maybe the church will be probably regarded as an unlucky place where there's nothing growing. By growth, it might mean the plants. It's not referring to plants over here. Growth in over here. Sorry, we are referring to people coming in. People stop when they stop coming to church. The church is not growing. The church is not thriving. So that's why it might be regarded as a unlucky place. Then stanza 4. The Again he continues this thing. People, weird people, very suspicious people, they might come here and they might, try and con people, cheat people. They might be selling simples. Simples is basically, it might be herbs, sorry, herbs which, will, you have all these jari booty which you call. People will be selling these jari booty for, acha, cancer theek ho jayega, or, you will have, if you have a particular disorder or a condition, that'll get cured. And you'll have people who will be there in the church ke naam pe, they'll be cheating you. So that might happen. That might happen. So the church as such, it being a holy ground, the it might be used by people like this because it was a church, because the grounds are holy. And I think I must mention this. In the earlier days and up to recent times also, churches used to be built on very specific grounds. You have something called ley lines. I don't know if anybody has heard of ley lines. Has anyone know what ley lines are? They're
I don't.
magnetic lines. They're magnetic lines. Okay, so they're supposed to be where there's power. There's power in the ground itself. So it's a very interesting fact. So you had places where there were ley lines, जहाँ पे होता था, you have churches built either on them or close to them. So the church gets power. Church draws power from that. It's a kind of a scientific thing, you can say. So that is there. Science and religion mixing. Anyway, so what would happen is nature would reclaim the church finally if people would stop, coming there. And then the fifth stanza, the thought is continued again. The church will become less and less recognizable. It'll become hidden by nature. It'll be taken over by nature. And the speaker wonders who will be the last ones to seek the church out for what it is. Would it be the caretaker? Rude lofts are mentioned in that particular stanza. They're nothing but galleries which are above the choir. Choir is a group of people who sing in church, right? So ruin bibbers are people who seek excitement. चलो antique है, let's go and check this place out because antique है वहाँ पे कुछ तो मिलेगा. Let's go and search for something. We might come something, treasure hunting kind of a thing. So you might have people like that coming to church to seek out stuff, excitement, and hunt for something. People, some stones or some secrets of the church, because churches are have history. They have a lot of churches are hundreds of years old. So speaker again thinks that the visitor might be a person who just might miss the smell of Christmas. And because he thinks, I mean, how can you have a church without, I mean, how can you have Christmas without a church? When you have Christmas abroad, or here also, you have a midnight mass. So 24th night you have midnight mass, and you have masses the entire day the next day. So it's a very big thing. It's a huge thing. It's a total celebration. And how can you have Christmas without the church? So this is what the speaker is asking. So the visitor might be a person who just misses going to church and would come there. And you have terms like gown and band, referring to again things worn by clergymen. And speaker then says that he wants to smell the scent of myrrh. Myrrh is it's a gum resin. It's a kind of resin which is found in particular trees, which is grows in Eastern Africa and Arabia. Now, the this myrrh is one of the three presents which was given to Jesus when he was born by the holy men who came to visit him when he was born. Right, and the speaker also wants to hear organ music as he did when he was a kid, and probably he thinks the last person who comes to church, maybe who's a bit like him, he may not be a proper believer in the religion itself, but the place, because it has a very mystic, a very strange power that uh, holy places have, temples, be it a mosque, temple, gurdwara, or they all these places of worship have certain power. So it might that particular place might have value to someone. So that's what the speaker thinks might happen. That might be the last visitor might think like that. Okay, now in stanza 6, he doesn't remain unmoved. He is of the opinion that the church is special, and there is ghostly silt. Ghostly silt, ghosts again could mean spirits, which are ghosts as in booth, and holy ghost, which refers to the Christianity. Silt is the fine earth left over by rivers and floods. So ghostly silt are spread and all over the cross of the ground. Cross of the ground is churches were built in the shape of a cross. So he's referring to that over here. And so the word tends could have dual meaning, but tending to care for, as in ground being, dekbhal karna, as in caring for, and a tendency to travel. So that to travel through scrub, to visit the grounds, to feel the strange power. So you might be the word tends is a person coming to the grounds, traveling and to visit the ground, or it could be to caring for. And this special shell in the particular stanza refers to the church, which is seen a lot: marriages, births, deaths. Speaker sees tells himself, that the church. I mean, churches. It can't be all bad. There is special in each and every church. And in spite of his indifferent and very slightly mocking attitude, you he refers to frowsty, uncared for, that is Ban. He can spend the time over here because he feels the silence over here makes him feel good and he'd like to spend more time. Then we come to the last stanza where the speaker realizes that ordinary man of the church will always have a cherished, the church will have a special place in the ordinary man's heart because they will have faith in it. If they don't have faith in the religion, maybe, but the church is something which is a special, which will have power, and he calls it a serious house on earth. It will always remain a symbol of faith. So, even though earlier he mocked the church, his actions through the entire poem contradicts his words, and taking off his bicycle clips, signing the book, and everything. And he says that humans have a hunger, we need something to believe in. We need something that we have to have faith in because we can't do without. We need something to hold on to. So it's not whether we believe in God or not, but he asks, w- I mean, what can a man do to replace God? Can God be replaced by a church or what? I mean, so church over here may not be important because of the God inside the church, but by itself, the church has a power, has value. So that's the thing. Okay, right. Moving on to the themes. Theme is religious, but poet is taking a dismissive, mocking attitude. And the other themes are melancholy, chaos, which is sorry for the typos. There are some typos. I've added some material, so there is some errors in it. There is it's the chaos which is there. It's the effect of the World War, and realism is what is happening. the disintegration of religion and the church as a system. That is realism. These are some of the themes. The mood is very somber, glooming, slightly mocking, and there is satire. There is a subtle seriousness in it. Church-going style is got it's got 7 stanzas, 9 iambic pentameter, 5 iambs per line, with each line is ending in slant. Slant rhyme is almost rhyming, but not fully, and there are full rhymes as well. And meter is 5 beats per line. It's a common meter in American English. Larkin breaks down the pattern of iambic pentameter. He breaks it down so that we it doesn't have a sing-song quality. So basically, when you're using slant rhyme, you don't have a sing-song thing. You have slightly a tone, a more conversational tone. Yeah. The poet's tone is skeptical, dismissive, using direct conversational tone, speaking to the reader. His lines have ironic yet lyrical cadence. Right, poetic devices, rhyme scheme. I've already said the rhyme scheme is 7 stanzas, 9 lines each. A B A B C A D C D rhyme scheme. He is using slant rhyme and full rhyme to create a conversation. And slant rhyme, I've given examples of on stone organ. I won't go into it because I've taken too much of time. I'll just quickly go through this. End stop lines. He has used end stop lines to give a sense of completion in certain stanzas. It gives a kind of conclusion, sense of conclusion. Examples are given. Or after dark will dubious women come to make their children touch a particular stone. Pick simples for a cancer. Or some advised night. See walking a dead one. Enjambment is there using a particular thought which is continuing into the next. Then there's caesura. Caesura is a pause within a line. It's marked by a period, comma, or em dash. It's called an em dash. It's used to create emphasis. So you stop and you think and you read that line back. From where I stood, the roof looks almost new. Okay, there's a stop, there's a gap over there, the caesura there. And then again, only in separation, marriage and birth. And okay, Spondi is used here. It's accented two accented syllables followed by an unaccented syllable. Thud shut. It has got a sound effect, an onomatopoeic effect. Emphasizing the door shutting. Trochee, dactyl, anapest. Guys, I'm rushing through this a little. Please go through it. In case there's some doubt, please ask me, of course. Personification, alliteration, assonance, and the meaning of the title is there's a play on the words church going, which talks about going, basically going, people who go to church as a habit, that is lost its charm. People have stopped going, and so going to church is going out of fashion, something like that. So there's a play on the words there. And I've used a particular I have taken a particular question from the past papers. Why do you think Larkin titles his poem Church Going? So it's one of his finest poems and symbolizing postmodernism. In fact, G.S. Fraser calls it the movement's prize poem. The title is doing a play on words where the church going has two meanings, going to church, and the other can be interpreted as a decline of going to church. So that's that. And so this was the time, the post-war World War Britain, and victory. There was the victory. In spite of the victory which the Allies had won, they Britain has suffered a lot of losses, lives, damage to property, and all. And the church, which was supposed to provide answers over here, was not up to it, and the support the men needed, the common man needed. So they were not given that. So the common man, about whom Larkin wrote and glorified, in fact, in his works, they were relying on church to fulfill their needs, give answers and give support. So they had lost faith in that. And I'll just conclude by saying that, Larkin's language, a little bit about him, he is very simple, lucid, and he doesn't use too many allusions, mythology, and all. talks to you straight, and you understand, and you're able to interpret the particular poem very easily without thinking too much about it. For him, the reasons aren't religious, because church is a peaceful place, and he says, even though he seems to be disinterested, but the church, he believes, is a symbol of something which will people will hold on to in trying times. And how much ever science and technology, whatever advancement they make, it will not give a solace, it will not give peace to a man's soul. And there will always be a small percentage of people who will go to church to find answers of life. So church going would not end, it will not die out. Right, guys? So that's it from me. I'll end over here.
Once I'm sure there's nothing going on, I step inside, letting the door thud shut. Another church, matting, seats and stone, and little books, sprawlings of flowers, cut for Sunday, brownish now. Some brass and stuff up at the holy end, the small neat organ, and a tense, musty, unignorable silence brewed God knows how long. Hatless, I take off my cycle clips in awkward reverence. Move forward, run my hand around the font. From where I stand, the roof looks almost new, cleaned or restored. Someone would know, I don't. Mounting the lectern, I peruse a few hectoring large-scale verses and pronounce, "Here endeth," much more loudly than I'd meant. The echoes snigger briefly. Back at the door, I sign the book, donate an Irish sixpence, reflect the place was not worth stopping for. Yet stop I did. In fact, I often do, and always end much at a loss like this, wondering what to look for. Wondering, too, when churches will fall completely out of use, what we shall turn them into. If we shall keep a few cathedrals chronically on show, their parchment, plate and pyx in locked cases, and let the rest rent-free to rain and sheep. Shall we avoid them as unlucky places? Or after dark will dubious women come to make their children touch a particular stone, pick simples for a cancer, or on some advised night see walking a dead one? Power of some sort will go on, in games, in riddles, seemingly at random, but superstition, like belief, must die. And what remains when disbelief has gone? Grass, weedy pavement, brambles, buttress, sky, a shape less recognizable each week, a purpose more obscure. I wonder who will be the last, the very last, to seek this place for what it was. One of the crew that tap and jot and know what rude lofts were? Some ruined bibber, randy for antique, or Christmas addict, counting on a whiff of gown and bands and organ pipes and myrrh? Or will he be my representative, bored, uninformed, knowing the ghostly silt dispersed, yet tending to this cross of ground through suburb scrub, because it held unspilt so long and equably what since is found only in separation, marriage and birth and death, and thoughts of these, for which was built this special shell. For though I've no idea what this accoutred frowsty barn is worth, it pleases me to stand in silence here. A serious house, on serious earth it is, in whose blent air all our compulsions meet, are recognized and robed as destinies, and that much never can be obsolete, since someone will forever be surprising a hunger in himself to be more serious, and gravitating with it to this ground, which, he once heard, was proper to grow wise in, if only that so many dead lie round.